The wind howled through the city like a wounded animal that night, dragging dry leaves across cracked sidewalks and rattling the iron ribs of a forgotten bridge. Beneath it, in the dark hollow where light rarely reached, a small family huddled together, 3 souls bound by blood, love and loss. The father, Arman, sat with his back against the cold concrete pillar, his arms wrapped tightly around his wife and son. His coat was too thin for winter. Its seams had split near the shoulders, and every gust of air found its way through. But he held them close anyway, as if his body heat alone could stand between them and the creeping frost. Beside him, Layla tried to quiet her trembling hands as she pulled the boy closer to her chest. Her breath came out in white clouds, uneven and shallow. The scarf around her head was torn and damp, and her eyes, once bright with laughter, had dulled into a quiet endurance that only mothers know. She said nothing. Words had long since lost their use here, and between them lay Sammy, their 8-year-old son, wrapped in a patchwork blanket that had seen more roads than years. His face was half buried in his mother's chest, his small body shivering with each gust that slipped through the cracks of their shelter. Yet even in the cold he did not cry. He had learned, far too early, that tears froze before they fell. Above them cars passed on the bridge, their headlights streaking across the underpass in brief flashes of gold and white. The noise was a reminder of a world that had moved on, a world of warm homes and heavy dinners, of laughter spilling from lit windows. Down here, the world was stripped bare to its bones, steel, stone, and survival. Arman's stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since morning. He could bear it, he always did. But he watched Sammy with growing worry. The boy's lips had turned pale and his breathing was shallow. He reached into the old canvas bag beside him and pulled out their last piece of bread. It was hard as stone, but when he broke it in half, the boy looked up with tired eyes that still held trust. Arman smiled, pretending it was enough. "Eat, my son," he whispered, pressing the piece into Sammy's hands. "Tomorrow, we'll find something better." The boy nodded, not out of belief, but because he didn't want his father to see doubt. He took a small bite, chewed slowly, and handed what remained to his mother. She shook her head at first, but he insisted. "Please, Mama," he said softly. "You have to eat too." Layla's lips trembled as she took it. She looked at her husband, then at the boy, and smiled the kind of smile that hurts to hold. "Thank you, my heart," she murmured. For a long while the only sound was the river below, slow, steady, and indifferent. Arman's gaze drifted toward it. Once he had worked by that same river, hauling crates at the docks. He used to come home tired but proud, smelling of sweat and salt, with enough money for food and rent. But the factory closed, the jobs vanished, and with them, the fragile walls of their old life crumbled. A few months later came the eviction notice, the desperate nights, the bridge. He tilted his head back and stared at the underbelly of the bridge above. If I could just start over, he thought. If I could just give them one warm night. But starting over had become a luxury of people who still had something to lose. The wind grew colder. Snow began to fall, soft at first, then thick and heavy. The flakes clung to Arman's hair and shoulders, melting into thin trails that stung his skin. He brushed them from Sammy's face, careful not to wake him. "Sleep," he whispered. "Dream of summer." Layla leaned against his arm, her eyes half closed. "Do you think it'll stop by morning?" she asked. "It always does," he lied gently. She nodded, trusting his voice more than his words. Together they sat in silence, listening to the sound of snow meeting earth, the slow heartbeat of winter itself. Hours passed. The city above slept. At dawn, the sky cracked open with a pale light. The snow had piled around them like a quiet grave, and Arman's limbs ached with stiffness. His breath came out ragged. He stood slowly, careful not to wake his wife and son, and climbed the small hill toward the street. From up there, he could see the city stretching out, grey and distant like a promise never kept. He searched for something, anything, a cafe throwing out leftovers, a shelter opening its doors. But all he saw were people walking quickly, collars turned up, eyes down. The world was too busy surviving itself to notice 3 forgotten souls under a bridge. He returned with empty hands and heavier steps. Layla looked up as he approached. Her eyes asked the question she didn't voice. He shook his head. She sighed, brushing a bit of snow from Sammy's hair. "He's dreaming," she said quietly. "He smiled just now." Armin knelt beside them. "Maybe he's dreaming of home." She looked at him. "Do you still dream of it?" He paused, then nodded. "Every night. But it's fading." Her eyes softened. "Then dream harder," she whispered. For the first time in weeks he almost laughed. But before he could reply, Sammy stirred. The boy sat up, blinking against the white light filtering through the cracks. His small hands reached out and caught something half buried in the snow beside him. A small, rusty key shaped like ivy, with a faint symbol carved at the base. A tiny pine tree. "What's that?" Layla asked softly. Sammy turned it over in his palm. "I don't know," he said, "but it looks special." Arman leaned closer, brushing away the frost to see it better. The metal was old, worn smooth by time. "Where did you find it?" "Right here," the boy said, "next to me." He held it up to the light, and for a brief second it gleamed like a spark in the middle of all that grey. Layla smiled faintly. "Maybe it's lucky." Armin took the key, weighing it in his hand. It was small, cold, ordinary, and yet something about it stirred in him, like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. He handed it back to his son. "Then keep it," he said. "It's yours now." Sammy nodded and slipped it into his pocket, and though none of them could explain why, the air around them felt a little less heavy, the morning a little less cruel. As the snow fell quietly around them, a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds and touched the ground beside the family. It wasn't much, but in that moment it was enough. The sun rose weakly the next morning, pale and uncertain, as though it too feared to face the cold. Beneath the bridge, a faint mist hovered over the river, curling between the stones like breath that never quite vanished. The snow had hardened overnight, forming a crust that cracked softly under small, bare feet. Sammy was the first to wake. He rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly, his blanket sliding off his shoulders in a puff of frost. His parents were still asleep, his mother's arm wrapped around his father's waist, their bodies curled toward each other for warmth. They looked so still that for a moment he was afraid to move. He reached into his pocket and felt the small metal key resting there, cold, heavy, real. He turned it over in his palm again, tracing the shape of the ivy that wrapped around its spine, the tiny pine tree carved near the base. It looked like it belonged to another world, a world where things still worked, where doors opened and people smiled when they saw you. He held it up to the light that filtered through the cracks in the bridge. The metal caught the sun, and for just a heartbeat. It gleamed. Sammy smiled. He didn't know why. But the little key made him feel something he hadn't felt in weeks. Curious. When Armin finally stirred awake, he found his son crouched near the edge of the river, poking the ice with a stick. Layla had already begun to gather what little they owned. A threadbare blanket, a dented thermos, an old tin that once held soup. The morning was cruelly beautiful, the kind of day that reminded them how far away comfort really was. "Come back from the water, Sammy," Armin called gently. "It's slippery." The boy turned, smiling faintly. "I found something," Armin sighed, rubbing his stiff hands together. "Another stone?" "No," Sammy said, holding out his palm. "The key again. But I think it wants to show us something." Armin frowned, stepping closer. "Wants to show us?" Sammy nodded earnestly. "I don't know how, but when I hold it, it feels warm. Like it's pulling." Layla glanced up from folding the blanket. "Maybe it's just the sun, sweetheart." But Armin knelt down beside his son, curiosity quietly stirring in his chest. The boy's eyes were wide, reflecting the light, and for a moment Armin saw something that had been missing from them for far too long. Hope. He didn't believe in magic, not anymore. But he believed in his son's eyes. "All right," he said softly. "Show me." They began walking along the riverbank, following no map and no path, just the feeling that the key wanted to lead them somewhere. The snow reached their ankles, numbing their feet, But Sammy pressed on. He clutched the key tight, glancing every so often at the symbol on it, the tiny pine tree that now seemed almost alive in the morning light. Layla followed silently, her scarf pulled tight around her face. "We can't go too far," she said. "We need to be back before dark." "We will," Armin promised. But in truth, he didn't know where they were going, or why he was letting his son lead them at all. Maybe it was the silence of the day, the stillness of the river, or the simple need to believe that something, anything, waited for them beyond the bridge. The city began to fade behind them, replaced by long stretches of frozen fields and clusters of bare trees. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper. Sammy's steps quickened. He could feel the weight of the key grow warmer, as if it were leading him forward, whispering through his palm. "There," he said suddenly, pointing. Up ahead, a narrow trail cut through the trees, winding up a small hill. The path was old, half buried beneath snow and fallen branches, but it was clear enough to see. At the top stood a lone pine tree, taller than the rest, its branches heavy with frost. Armand felt something shift inside him. "The same tree," he murmured. "The one on the key," Layla's breath caught. "What are the chances?" Sammy looked up at them, his eyes glowing with that rare, quiet light children carry when they know something the world has forgotten. "Can we go?" Armand nodded. "Let's see what's there." The climb was slow. The snow deepened and the wind picked up, whispering through the branches like old voices. Halfway up, Layla stumbled, her foot slipping on a patch of ice. Armand caught her, pulling her close. "You okay?" She nodded, smiling faintly despite the cold. "I'm fine. Just tired." He looked at her face, thin, pale, worn, but her eyes still held strength. The kind that keeps a family alive even when everything else has fallen apart. They kept walking. At the top, beneath the pine tree, they found a small wooden box half buried in snow. Its corners were rounded with age, its latch rusted shut. Sammy gasped and dropped to his knees, brushing away the frost. "Try the key," Layla whispered. Sammy looked up at his father, almost afraid to hope. Armand gave a small nod. The boy slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. A soft click echoed through the frozen air. The lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, lay a handful of old coins, a photograph, and a small note written in faded ink. The photograph showed a family, a man, a woman, and a little boy, standing by the same pine tree, smiling. Layla pressed her fingers to her mouth. The boy in the photo looked just like Sammy. The note was simple, written in careful looping handwriting. "For whoever finds this, don't lose hope. This tree has seen many winters, but it still stands. So will you." For a long moment no one spoke. The only sound was the wind, moving softly through the branches. Armand looked at the photo again, then at his own family. He felt something he hadn't felt in months, a warmth that didn't come from fire or food, but from somewhere deeper. Layla reached out, touching the edge of the box. "It's like they left it for us," Sammy smiled. "Maybe they did." Armand closed the box gently, then placed his hand on the trunk of the pine tree. The bark was rough beneath his fingers, but solid, alive. He looked down at his son and whispered, "Then maybe this is where things begin again." As they stood there, the wind softened, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. The sun broke fully through the clouds, spilling gold across the snow. And for the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a promise. They left the bridge behind the next morning. There was no formal decision, no speech or plan, just a quiet understanding that the place which had sheltered their sorrow had also buried their hope. The air felt different when they woke. Maybe it was the light, or maybe it was the way Sammy stood taller, holding the small wooden box close to his chest, as though it contained not just old coins and a photograph, but a reason to keep walking. The sky was clear and fragile blue. Frost glittered on every surface like powdered glass, and each breath they took came out in white blooming clouds. They followed the river first, its edge lined with brittle reeds and patches of ice that cracked beneath their steps. Armand walked in front, scanning for anything they might use. Wood, scraps, food left behind by someone kinder than the world. Layla followed, her scarf pulled high, humming softly to herself, an old tune that once echoed through their home's kitchen when life was still warm and loud. And Sammy, he led them more by feeling than direction. The key hung around his neck now, tied to a string, and every time it touched his skin, he said it felt alive. Alive. Armand had asked once. Sammy nodded. Like it knows we're close to something. Armand smiled at that. He didn't believe in things knowing where to go, but he believed in his son's certainty. It had carried them farther than logic ever had. By noon, they reached the outskirts of an abandoned district, a cluster of half-collapsed buildings, the bones of a town that had once thrived. Storefronts stood empty, windows shattered, doors leaning on rusted hinges. A faded sign swung above the road, its letters barely legible. Willow's End. Layla shivered. It looks forgotten. Armand scanned the area. Forgotten isn't always bad, he murmured. Sometimes that means no one will chase us away. They found shelter in an old diner with cracked tiles and a roof that mostly held. Dust lay thick on the counters, and the smell of rust and rain filled the air. But there was a stove in the back and a pile of old crates for firewood. Sammy began exploring immediately, small footsteps echoing between the booths. "Be careful," Layla called. "I will," he shouted back, his voice light for once. Armand knelt by the stove, trying to coax flame from damp matches. It took time, but when the first spark caught, Layla gasped softly, the orange glow flickering across her face. They hadn't seen real fire in weeks. It felt like life returning. That night, they sat together on the floor, eating from a tin can they had found in the kitchen, beans half expired but still edible. The fire cracked softly, and the shadows danced on the walls like ghosts trying to remember how to move. Sammy took the photograph from the box and studied it again. The smiling family beneath the pine tree looked so peaceful, so full of a happiness that seemed foreign now. "Do you think they're still alive?" he asked. Layla hesitated, then said gently, "Maybe not in the way you mean. But the note they left, it means they wanted someone else to keep living for them. Maybe that's us." Sammy thought about that, tracing the pine tree in the background. "Then we have to do something," he said. "Something good." Armand looked at his son. "Like what?" Sammy shrugged. "Fix this place. Make it ours. So if someone else comes here, they find hope too." The firelight caught Armand's eyes. For a moment he didn't speak. The idea sounded impossible, and yet something in it made sense. The world had taken everything from them. Maybe the only way to fight back wasn't to run, but to rebuild. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." Layla smiled faintly. "Then tomorrow we begin again." The next morning the family began working. Armand used old boards and nails from the diner's storage to patch the roof and repair the front door. His hands were numb, the tools worn, but every swing of the hammer sounded like defiance. Layla cleaned the inside, sweeping away years of dust and cobwebs, humming as she worked. Sammy gathered what he could from nearby, stones, sticks, even a rusted metal sign that he decided would become their door plate. By afternoon, sunlight streamed through the cleaned windows, illuminating the once-dead room. The air still smelled faintly of rust, but beneath it was something new, warmth, effort, home. When they sat by the fire again that evening, they were exhausted, but smiling. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. Days passed. Then weeks. The world beyond the little town kept spinning, unaware of three souls quietly reclaiming a life from its ruins. The diner transformed slowly into something almost beautiful. They named it the Pine Place, after the tree that had brought them here. Armand fixed the sign himself, painting the words with an old brush dipped in melted snow and soot. Layla found wild herbs near the river, turning them into soups. Sammy built a shelf for the wooden box, setting the photograph on it like a sacred relic. Sometimes travelers passed through, the kind of people who had also fallen through life's cracks. Armand would give them warm food, a seat near the fire, and a story. This place saved us, he would say simply. So it's only right we let it save others. Word spread slowly, as word always does in forgotten places. Soon more came. Quiet faces, hungry hearts, people who had nowhere else to go. They shared what they had, rebuilt what they could. And piece by piece, Willow's End began to live again. One evening, as the first snow of the new winter began to fall, Sammy stood outside the diner, staring at the horizon. The pine tree on the hill was visible from here, its branches glistening white. The boy had grown taller, his eyes steadier, but the key still hung around his neck. He felt Armand's hand on his shoulder. "You did this," his father said softly. "You found the key." "You found us again," Sammy smiled faintly. "I just followed where it led." Armand looked out toward the pine tree. "Maybe that's what life is," he said. "Following the things that make you feel alive, even when you don't know where they lead," Layla called from inside, her voice warm and steady. "Dinner's ready." They turned back toward the diner. The lights glowed through the windows, golden and alive, cutting through the snow like hope made visible, and for the first time in a long time, Armand realized this wasn't just survival anymore, this was living. Winter deepened, but the pine place glowed like a beacon amid the snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the laughter of children, some theirs, some travelers, mixed with the soft crackle of the fire. The diner had become more than shelter. It had become a sanctuary, a small oasis in a world that often seemed too cruel to bear. Sammy had grown stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. Every day he carried the key in his pocket, a constant reminder of how far they had come. Though small, it was a talisman of hope, a literal key to doors they had once thought closed forever. One morning Armand noticed Sammy staring intently at the horizon. "What is it?" he asked. Sammy didn't answer at first. His eyes were fixed on the hill where the pine tree stood, the snow sparkling on its branches like diamonds. Then finally he whispered, I think it wants me to go there." Armand knelt beside him. "The key?" Sammy nodded. "It feels like the story isn't finished." Layla joined them, placing a hand on Sammy's shoulder. "Sometimes we follow the path, not because we know the end, but because we need to see the journey complete." Armand sighed but smiled faintly. "Then we go, together." They packed lightly, leaving the diner in the capable hands of those they had helped along the way. The journey to the pine tree was quiet, the snow muffling their steps, the cold sharp against their faces. Sammy walked at the front, the key clutched in his small hand, glowing almost as if it had a life of its own. When they reached the hill, the tree towered above them, strong and unyielding. Sammy approached it, placing the key against its bark. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, a small hollow in the trunk began to glow faintly. Sammy's breath caught. "Is it magic?" Layla whispered. Armand shook his head. "It's something better. It's hope, and courage, and love, all wrapped together." Sammy inserted the key, and the hollow opened to reveal a small wooden box, identical to the one they had found by the river weeks ago. Inside were letters, photographs, and trinkets belonging to families who had once stood where they stood. Generations of hope, preserved for those who dared to follow the path, left as a gift for the ones brave enough to find it. Sammy's eyes welled with tears. He lifted the box reverently. "We're part of it now," he said softly. Layla hugged him tightly. "And now we keep it alive. We share it, just like the others did." Armand stood back, looking at the tree and the snow around them. He thought of the bridge, of the river, of the diner, and of the countless nights they had spent shivering under blankets of frost. They had walked through despair and hunger, through fear and doubt, and yet here they were, stronger, braver, and whole. The boy raised the key toward the sky. "We'll come back," he promised. "And we'll bring others too. Everyone who needs hope. They'll find it here." The wind swirled around them, carrying flakes of snow like tiny stars. For the first time, the world felt infinite, filled with possibility rather than threat. The past was not forgotten, but it no longer held them captive. As they descended the hill, the hollow safely tucked under Sammy's arm, They were no longer just a family who had survived. They were a family who had reclaimed life, who had built a home from nothing, and who had learned that even the smallest key can unlock the greatest stories. Back at the Pine Place, the fire burned brighter than ever. Travelers gathered, drawn to warmth and the promise of shelter. Children ran through the snow outside, laughing freely, and in the kitchen, Layla stirred a pot of soup, the aroma carrying into the night, mingling with the soft glow of lanterns and the murmur of conversation. Sammy placed the wooden box on a shelf above the stove, where it could be seen by all who entered. The photograph of the smiling family rested on top, a reminder of journeys past and the hope that had carried them forward. Armin looked around at the faces, at the life they had built from ashes and despair. He realized then that survival had been only the beginning. Living, truly living, meant creating, giving, and passing hope to those who needed it most. And somewhere deep in the night, the wind whispered through the pine tree on the hill, as if acknowledging the promise kept by a small boy, a brave mother, and a determined father. The key had found its rightful owners, but more importantly, they had found themselves, and in doing so, they had unlocked a future that was brighter than any past could ever shadow. Together, they sat by the fire, the snow falling softly outside, hearts full, knowing that no matter how cold or dark the world might grow, hope would always shine, and the key would always guide them home.